Okay, and greetings everyone. Apologies for a bit of a technical hiatus, so which caused us a bit of a delay, but we'll make up for it. Okay. So, well, it turned out that I was speaking in another broadcast, so I guess I need to go back to where I left it and make you guess what was said there. So, just one moment, please. Here, just one moment. Okay, Amrita, you need to go to another room, honey. So welcome to part 3 of the Tantra today. And we have very exciting theme today. We're kind of going to give us a spinning summary of what really is behind this initiative to put this together as this compact introductory level course that give us an idea, perhaps to rehabilitate few things, to put few things into perspective. And I will pick it up where we have left it last time, when we have addressed that power behind all transformations. And as we will be speaking today about the actual process of the ascent, or simply known as Kundalini rising, I would like to give us like very brief overview. At least this is when I have entered the scene, and this is how I have found this to be spoken at the time when this was very clearly understood from direct first-hand experience. And yet when coming out to work with people, to coming out to teach, I have found out very soon that there's no agreement. In fact, there's a lot of confusion, a lot of disagreement, and this term Kundalini causes a lot of misconceptions and misperceptions inside the spiritual community itself, among the teachers, among the facilitators, among the practitioners. Just to give you an example, which says it all, a very well-known American teacher from the United States, publicly at one of his satsangs, called it spiritual candy, whilst at the same time, at least 3 of his students, who are now teachers, or fully fledged teachers in their own right, came to me in private to seek some help because they could not receive it with their teacher, who in private called that going through hell. So between that spiritual candy and going through hell, this kind of gives us that overview of how Kundalini process is being viewed by large in spiritual community. And there are these extremes of misunderstanding, extremes of demonizing it, or extremes of glorifying it, or extremes of simply having no clue. With that being said, situation has changed somewhat. So it's not as bad as it was 10 years ago. And there is definitely a lot of interest these days from primarily another generation of teachers and another generation of spiritual practitioners, where attempts are made to rehabilitate this term, strip it from all this new agey stuff, strip it from unnecessary also mythologizing of that process, where we have the potential and the possibility to have some real understanding as what is going on behind the scenes when we speak about these esoteric processes pertinent to this alchemical transformation of individualized consciousness into a higher order, we could say, into the essentially vehicle or vessel which can hold higher states of consciousness. This, we could put it as simple as that, because Kundalini itself is the power behind individuation. To remind ourselves that spiritual traditions, and when we speak of spiritual traditions, we primarily now, in the context of this particular series, speak of the monistic traditions. And in the monistic, non-dual traditions, the understanding of what behind individuation, or what is behind the power of consciousness to contract itself to such degree that it gets arrested to its own magnanimity, to its own infinity, to its own glory, to the effect of experiencing oneself, or to experiencing itself as that limited, finite individual. And that has nothing to do with that jargon, I am calling it, it's a spiritual jargon, ego. Even if I use that occasionally, it has no real value when it comes to transformative spiritual processes. No spiritual tradition ever blames ego to be the culprit behind all this. All this is hidden elsewhere, and Kundalini is the answer to this whole processes of individuation, and likewise coming into the light of one's own awareness through the process of ascent and unfoldment, where that individuation undergoes transformation. So this in coming out of age, it could be spoken of in terms of this maturity, in terms of this entering yet another phase. If we are to speak of Kundalini, as I often speak with people, especially who go through dramatic phases or who find themselves with no psychological support and do not know what's going on to them, one of the basic, if you will, line of communication that would be offered is first to express this in terms of the normality of human evolution, so as to have that very, very clear understanding that there's nothing abnormal about the way human psyche matures. This maturity of the human psyche is often spoken in terms of and with comparison of coming of age. The maturity of the human body itself here, the maturity of the character, maturity of this individuation is also part and parcel of that process. So once we reach certain maturity, then the next stage, obviously, is to overcome these limitations which this individuality inevitably presents due to the fact that this individuality is essentially at the high price of not being able to live life by experiencing that what essentially is beyond any change, beyond any modulations, and therefore is beyond anything that could be subjected to misery, suffering, anything that what we easily identify with when we only consider ourselves to be this perishable human organism. So when we speak of the active process of Kundalini, what I feel like saying is that it can display itself and manifest itself in so many different ways. It can manifest itself in once in a lifetime experience, literally, as the most extraordinary, once in a lifetime experience, never to be re-experienced again, with all the power and glory poured into it and out of it. Or it can be a gradual, painstaking, phase by phase, step by step process of transformation of consciousness, which will take years, decades, dare I say, in some cases, lifetimes. So this is what we speak to now. And again, I would like to immediately mention that this is by no means the last word, because in the format of this series, Tantra Today, it is served only at the introductory level, and we'll have to keep coming back to it, as I said, on all possible occasions. So what is it and how it manifests, so that for the interests of those of you who are perhaps undergoing this process, have had some real profound experience in the past, or just had some brush with this and it all kind of fizzled away or subsided. And when we speak about Kundalini rising, this is very important to have this understanding that it will never display and exhibit itself in such way that we can apply one size fits all, but rather it will have unique expression in each and every one of us, depending on so many factors that alone will make a whole book. Suffice to say is that what comes under the possibility of giving it a discourse or discussion is applying this universal and that what tradition deals with in terms of classical and clinical observations of how this process is being experienced, what it is accompanied by, the phenomenology of it all, and how, above all else, that translates in terms of the real, tangible changes in one's awareness, in one's consciousness. So here we will begin to speak about it in terms of ups and downs of that process, so that there is understanding that Kundalini is not always rising as a given straight to its goal, even if that is clearly understood by someone at intellectual or mental or any other levels. These ups and downs of the process is very well known phenomena. What affects this, what factors play here, an important role, of course, is what comes under the category of Kundalini care. And we will give our due attention to it when we will dedicate a specific program, when we will speak about all aspects of Kundalini unfoldment. But what I would like to add in the context of this discussion is that the amount of information that needs to be processed at a psychic level of each and every psychic center is what really marks the level of the ascent. And Kundalini is known for rising from center to center. And as it rises to each of these centers, she finds herself completely absorbed in that center. And whilst absorbing itself in the center, it begins to release the psychic information that this center is associated with. Up until that information is released, up until now, speaking in that kind of more metaphorical, classical language, up until Kundalini is fully satisfied at that level, up until she is fully saturated, it cannot progress further in a steady manner. And with that being said, of course, certain cases of bypassing certain psychic centers are also known and need to be spoken with precision and clarity of understanding where that is a possibility and how can that happen. I will just add immediately to that it is not possible for Kundalini to ascend to the highest centers unless it had the chance to go through some of the crucial intermediary ones. So therefore, all these at times spoken kind of experiences of realization and enlightenment, whilst the psychic work hasn't been done, is a new age invention. It's simply impossible. In order for Kundalini to ascend to the highest centers, it needs to at least pass the threshold of the centers associated with elementary order, which are 5 in number. 5 in number, with the 5th classically spoken of known as Vishuddhi chakra, which is associated with the element of Akash or ether, which is the expressive potentiality of sound, expressive potentiality of space itself. So only when Kundalini can go beyond that, and when everything is clear, access to higher centers is granted. Now, what this in turn brings about is the necessity to speak about what makes this ascent stable, because tradition speaks about rising of Kundalini both in terms of the unstable nature of that rising versus that steady ascent. Obviously, if there is an amount of spiritual practice put forth, amount of guidance and understanding doubled by one's complete cooperation, dedication, and as an addition to that, this, if you will, what oils the process, that what comes from a different department other than just understanding, when this element of having this, well, quite frankly, this venerable attitude to these processes, then we know this to be a steady situation. And a steady situation produces steady ascent. Anything where this steadiness is lacking will end up with what is known as unstable rising. Unstable means people have spiritual experiences of Kundalini jumping, of Kundalini rushing up, and Kundalini does that whenever there is a given possibility. Once the steering and awakening takes place, it will do anything it can to expand within, because that's the power of consciousness. That power of individuation is contracted to itself, just like speaking from that perspective of Kashmir Shaivism. Individuality is not because there is ego as a separate entity. Monistic perspective do not recognize the autonomy of ego. Ego doesn't exist. It's an ephemeral, non-existent entity. What individuality is, Shiva in disguise in terms of its contraction. And this contraction is not also some haphazard experiment or a calamity that happened to Shiva, but a gradual, progressive, and dare we say, conscious overtaking, where consciousness, awareness contracts to itself to such degree where it gives birth to this visceral experience of so and so. This is the magnificent perspective that Kashmir Shaivism operates with, where individuality can be contemplated from a very, very different perspective. So that contraction, obviously, has this opposite side to it, and the opposite of that is that expansion. That expansion already present in any stages of its contraction in form of pure potentiality. And Kundalini follows these inherent forces within consciousness that prompts awakened Kundalini to expand immediately. As soon as that what is spoken of as the pericarp is broken or opened, then the force of one's awareness is no longer containable within a given region. It's like what I jokingly sometimes say, genie is out of the bottle. So this process of expansion inherent in consciousness is what makes Kundalini move in every direction. And of course, because of this particular setup of the esoteric anatomy, of how this spiritual anatomy, which essentially the entire light body, which is domain of the subtle, all the nerve channels, all these nadis, all this conglomerate of subtle pathways of energy, including above all else, the principal ones, are now being under the assault of the force of Kundalini. And that assault is successful to the degree of how clear are these passages. So when the passages are clear, ascent is profound, and we could even say immediate. In some cases, rare cases, it's as fast as it is immediate. It may take 3 days, it may take 3 months, or it may take 3 years. Please try to understand me here. This is all still considered to be immediate. Ramakrishna Paramahamsa spoken about his ascent, or the ascent of Kundalini he was going through, lasting 3 days. When we read the autobiography of a yogi of Swami Muktananda, that process took 8 years. And any other spiritual autobiographical accounts we come across, we can find different numbers of how it took, or how long it took, in terms of the full, complete ascent of that force to take before that stabilization in the stable unity consciousness can be spoken about. So as we can see, this ascent of consciousness, ascent of Kundalini here, is not a straightforward, a simple affair. I meant Muktananda's autobiography known as Play of Consciousness. And overall, it took 8 years for the great yogi who Muktananda was at the time of his initiation. He was already a great accomplished yogi, as we know it very well from his encounters and from the life that he lived as an ascetic from a very early age, meeting a lot of masters on the way, a lot of great siddhas, a lot of great saints of India, all of whom are figured in that spiritual autobiography. But we're counting it from the moment he received the Shaktipat from the Guru, at whose feet he received this initiation, finally coming back full circle to Swami Nityananda, and 8 years from there on. So the time span here, of course, is relevant only in terms of the reality of the physicality of the body. and of course cannot be spoken here in terms of how one can desire that process to unfold in one's own self, because it has nothing to do with what we can aspire for ourselves. One can aspire to have the most profound and the most powerful awakening, and one would like to complete this work in a given moment in time, but it's all down to nothing other than the grace. So this, I thought, will be enough to just mention the the reality of time, the time span. Furthermore, when we speak about these processes, what's important to understand is that not every rising, not every awakened Kundalini leads to its goal as a given. This is another, if you will, part where a lot of New Age stuff, full of confusing informations, that Kundalini is the intelligence itself, and as long as Kundalini is awakened, then it's guaranteed that it does what needs to be done, it knows what to do, and because it's the power of intelligence itself, and one will just need to, fasten the seatbelt until one arrives at the desired destination. The reason why not all risings lead to the same goal is simply because not all of them proceed equally through the same pathways of energy. And the content of this particular discussion is not allow us to go into minute details of these processes, but suffice to say is that only ascent through Sushumna and through its principal pathways that leads to the desired destination, union with the higher center in the Sahasrara, from where the process can then take different variations. Again, this is not part of our discussion today, but even within the Sushumna channel, I will single that one out. There is so-called Vajra Nadi, and the Vajra Nadi moves from the second chakra up to the plateau, but below the plateau, exemplified by the pineal gland, but it does not go beyond. It doesn't give access to the highest abode, and therefore it is agitated and moves only within these parameters. The Vajranadi is associated with the activity of sexual enjoyment and sexual pleasure, and it is always activated whenever we get aroused sexually. So in other words, Vajranadi is already active in, I would say, 99.9% of human beings. Vajranadi is active in most human beings who are sexually active. Therefore, there is nothing to be activated in that nadi. And yet, it's very often that Kundalini chooses that pathway from the place of the Svadhisthana, the chakra associated with the watery realm, and it goes all the way to the head, but not beyond the plateau. It meets the obstruction literally, impenetrable, because that nadi terminates there. That nadi does not have another pathway of energy. So therefore it's forced to go down, just as in every sexual act. But of course, it gives all the paraphernalia of a true spiritual experience. And the people who walk around considering themselves enlightened, just as sexual intercourse can give that flavor of bliss, beatitude, trepidation, ecstasy, everything. Orgasm itself can be be very close in its display with spiritual ecstasy, because it's the same force, just played at the different poles of its extreme. And yet, that's not the path, even within the Sushumna, that leads to the union of opposites here. And I'm not even talking about the pathways that are peripheral to the Sushumna, this so-called completely undesirable ascents in either of the channels, in either of the Saraswati channel or the Lakshmi channel, let alone any of the channels associated with Ida or Pingala. So this is why not every rising leads to its goal, simply because Kundalini is not automatically rises in Sushumna. There are many cases today, especially among the folks who wake up out of the blue with no spiritual preparation, with no vehicle as the instrumentality of the human body being prepared in any way, then the likelihood of the nervous system and all the aforementioned pathways of energy are being clogged, waxed. At times we speak about it in terms of being waxed. So all this stuff needs to be molten out of the system, dissolved. And until that happens, it will keep doing this ascends in inappropriate manner. So therefore, Kundalini rising, it's a science, a profound science in its own way, in its own right. And we speak about it at this introductory level, we feel is fitting to mention, so that there are no assumptions made, and so that there is no also speculations in terms of the verticality of that process. And just to say that today we will have a bit of an easier way with questions. The questions will be selected based on their emphasis, so that it's not a chat-like situation, because chat-like leads to chit-chat. So the team is going to select best questions, properly formulated, into a Google Doc, and I will look it up, and it will be easier for me to read it. So just thought to mention this so that you are aware. If you want to pose a question, please take a moment of consideration, how you put it across, how you formulate that, so that it's has a chance to be brought out into the larger view for us to speak about this. So this is with regard to this, if you will, sweeping perspective on Kundalini rising. What else can we add to this, other than what we have spoken about, and how these biases in terms of understanding of what really this process is about brings this tremendous percentage of spiritual, if you will, casualties and spiritual emergencies, because the body is not even being considered and brought into the picture. And elsewhere I spoke about that disparity, that utter disparity between the so-called non-duality circles, where the body is being dismissed completely, dismissed, not spoken about. It doesn't, well, who cares about the body if there's this Neo-Advaita operates with this, there's no one at home. You know, this is an illusion. It's a play of like some kind of imagination. It's a mirage, it's Maya, you know, like no one ever came into being, you know, this is only awareness. And another extreme is this various interdisciplinary yogic exercises where a lot of emphasis on physiology, but very little spiritual practice. You know, that it is not a secret that yoga has been reduced to asanas, pranayamas, and just a little bit of meditation just to, kind of like, so in other words, these two camps do not even interact, do not even cross-pollinate each other, you see? And that what creates that unhealthy situation in spiritual climate where people do not get fuller picture and the importance of the body is neglected. And the body, when it's neglected, it begins to rebel. When awakening takes place, it doesn't matter what path we have chosen. We may have walked the path of Jnana Yoga, we may have walked path of Bhakti Yoga, or we may have walked the path of yogas where the emphasis on forcible control of breath so as to awaken the latent force. But once the awakening is taking place, it's taking place in the spiritual anatomy of the body and nowhere else. So all these bhaktas, all these jnanas, and all these yogis are here, begin to be subjected to the neurophysiological processes that they deal with at the level of the body. So therefore, tremendous amount of work is still ahead of us to repair and remedy the situation in spiritual circles, because the acknowledgement of that is still slow and scarce when it comes to even very large international events as all these spiritual conferences and so forth. The situation is not helped either by having this highly specialized, if you will, titles, names, when it comes to this process. The reason why Kundalini is being marginalized is also due to the fact that certain spiritual movements named their programs after Kundalini. The term Kundalini Yoga, devised by Yogi Bhajan, is in a way, and some of you know and remember when I spoke that on several occasions, I spoke that even at the platforms which belong to Kundalini Yoga as a tradition, as that methodology. Kundalini Yoga is an oxymoron because every yoga has Kundalini at its basis as the transformative power. There's no yoga without Kundalini, and there is no Kundalini without yoga. So therefore, Kundalini Yoga is just that, if you will, evocative term that rose sometimes, maybe on the wake of spiritual movement, which was very, very successful and popular back in the days, known as Siddha Yoga. And then came this Kundalini Yoga. So people who are interested in spirituality and desirous of knowing themselves, knowing, like know thyself belongs to everyone, where one goes and sits on a chair and tries to grok it with their mind at the, at the satsang with the teacher, where none of these processes are ever spoken about, or whether someone bends the body on the yoga mat in every possible contorted way so as to make the use of this body. Sooner or later, if these people are to experience the glory of who they are, they will have to go through this awakening of Kundalini. So having that marginalization of Kundalini is also happened due to the fact that this marginalized attitude towards the very term itself. Oh, Kundalini, oh, well, that's the Kundalini Yoga. I have nothing to do with it. Oh, that's Kundalini. Oh, that's Hatha Yogis. I'm doing the self-inquiry path. It's much more sophisticated and no need for all that. No need for all that mess. No need that mess. But when it comes to spiritual transformation, folks, I'm sorry to say, there is a lot of mess. In fact, if not for mess, there will be no need for spiritual transformation. Think about it that way. If there was no mess already, if everything was neat and tidy, there will be no need for spiritual practices, inquiries, methodologies, meditations, none of that. So ponder on this. Self-realization is not an added perspective onto something as a cherry on a cake. Self-realization is removing what doesn't serve, removing, revealing, and it shines forth on its own. So Kundalini is the power that reveals itself to itself for the sake of its own glory. That is the perspective we speak from. So from here, I would like to take a pause. We will come back to it in a Q&A session. And I'd like us to go now to this third pillar, exemplified in the very goal, which in the Trika system known as self-realization. Not just in the Trika system, but in all Tantra proper, these three pillars, when it comes to Kashmir Shaivism, this is unapologetically so. The Guru Shishya Parampara, the teacher-student, the awakening and rising of Kundalini as one's own consciousness contracted to itself, undergoing its expansion, and self-realization. So this self-realization in Trika Shaivism is essentially spoken always in terms of this understanding that it's not a personal affair. It's not something that happened to an individual. It removes the individual from the picture right from the start, even if one would still be utilizing the so-called inferior means. As you may recall, we spoke about the means in the part 2, upayas, those means to self-realization. Means in the ascending order, if you remember, we spoke about starting from the individual or individually tailored means to the means which are known as empowered means, to the means of working with and at the level of consciousness. Finally, no means means. Even if there are these means pertinent to individual consciousness, pertinent to the body, in fact, the teaching of Kashmir Shaivism proceeds from the understanding which is consciousness based from the start. Therefore, to take stand as consciousness is a prerequisite at any stage of one's, if you will, path when it comes to this profound philosophy. There's no such thing as I'm an individual and then I will one day realize that I'm the glory of Shiva. This is already a wrong perspective. Wrong perspective. And I always speak about that. Always I try to bring this a reminder. As soon as we start thinking that, well, you know, all this sounds great and fantastic, all this is nice and dandy, one day, you know, but right now I have this experience, I'm an individual, you know, like I'm suffering, I have these traumatic experiences, you know, life been kicking me, you know what, I need to take it easy, you know, let me progress on the path. Okay, so one day this glory of Shiva may be revealed to me, but I need to be practical. That's already a wrong, erroneous, fucked up perspective. Excuse my French. This is not correct inference. The perspective starts right from the start. This stand is taken. Even if you cannot stand, you still take that stand. These waves will come and roll you off. You still take that stand. The stand is that it never happens to an individual. This is an affair within consciousness. This affair will only be set within consciousness. That consciousness is my Shivahood. This, what I experience right now as this limited individual, is nothing other than power of Almighty, power of the Absolute to contract to itself to such degree, to contract within to such degree that it begins to experience itself as this limited individual. This is the understanding. And with this regard, or with this being said, monistic perspective is taken at the beginning of the journey. Remember that being said over and over? The first step equals to the last step in the monistic Shaiva tradition. The first and the last step are the same. So therefore you take that stand, you take that step here and now if you have not done that so. You take that stand and do not worry about how this will unfold or what am I going to do now, how I'm going to live my life, Shiva in disguise. I have to pay the bill, I have to do this, I have to do shop, I have to do, my business, my this, my children, my grandma. Don't worry about this. This is precisely why you feel that, is because of that magnificence of your own self, that through the power of its own energies, operating at all times, operable at all times, create this appearance of this individual. So we will speak about it more in a moment in terms of what to do about it. But this is the stand, a prerequisite. And up until that stand is taken, it's as if we haven't even started. We're still tiptoeing and toying around, playing around, rather than taking a plunge. Now, once this perspective is clearly understood at intellectual mental level, then there is this concession that this is all due to the dynamics of subject and object. And this subject and object, it's all there is. All Tantras and Kashmir Shaivism is not exception, but in Kashmir Shaivism, the emphasis on these minute dynamics, experiences, tensions, and trepidations between subject and object. It's all there is. That's where all the work is, inside these dynamics. So this taking us back to the very first part, when we introduced the concept of aham, idam. I hope you remember. Aham, I am. Idam, this. And everything in the field of our experience, we could say, is this aham, idam. I am this. Just as I am hungry, or I am great, or I am miserable, or I am so and so. All this is the dynamics between aham and idam. This is where apparent duality enters or comes into otherwise unperturbed state of oneness, which is never broken. So this dynamics, this tension, exemplified by aham idam, undergoes all these processes. And we speak now in a nutshell to the major perspectives of how realization is accompanied by subject-object dynamics, and so that there is this understanding, even if in a nutshell, of what is behind the scenes in terms of all our perceptions, all our experiencing. So these dynamics are relevant to absolutely every experience. Doesn't matter how gross or subtle these experiences are. From crude duality of I am and this, I am and this, I am and this landscape, I am and this interior, I am and this house, I am and this woman and this dog, I am and this whatever. is always this, if you will, dynamic of aham and idam. I am and this, you see? Up until there is this dynamic, the duality intact, and our experience is always essentially deprived of the state of union, and it's just perpetually splits us apart there and then. Then there are, of course, gradations to this, even as we have many times remind ourselves, even in the one who doesn't go through any spiritual practices, not interested in spirituality, and doesn't give a hoot, completely, lives at that level where only by day alone, right? By bread alone, I'm this body, this individual. We know that to be Shiva, right? We know that. We already understood that people who are not interested in spirituality is simply consciousness completely opaque to itself. There's no iota of movement yet there. In this present moment, exemplified by this maybe particular incarnation, is not happening. And it might not even happen. It may happen in next life, in 10 lives from here. God knows how many more. But even in those people, these degrees between I am and this is not always the same. There are these dynamics, and at times this becomes into focal point of awareness. At other times, the focus is diffused. So this I am and this stands in less sharp opposition to each other. Otherwise, it would not be possible to exist. The person will go bonkers, will explode, or God knows what may happen to it. But it has to, that tension has to, if you will, relax, fall back, release itself. And those spontaneous moments where these people find themselves in those spontaneous, right, the poor man's meditation, sitting somewhere, watching a movie, or, having a deep sleep, having a nap, going for a walk and not thinking much, just taking it, soaking it in. Yeah, those moments are all where this tension is in different degree. So from this gross perspective to the subtler perspective, subtler degrees of separation, all the way to the witnessing, that witnessing, which we speak repeatedly to, which is a prerequisite because it's a state of consciousness which affords the possibility of having finally arrived at the level where we no longer identify with our actions. It's a lofty achievement and a must for every human being desirous of liberation. Because up until there is identification with the action, then there is this very powerful mechanism which locks our psyche into that cycle. That biological wheel of samsara here rotates ceaselessly, so that witnessing state of consciousness brings the end to it, a relief, a repose. And then if one is desirous to enjoy greater degrees of one's consciousness, if one is desirous to enjoy more profound degrees, then the higher state of consciousness is a result of this desire. So from here, we now want to go back to this aham idam tension, aham idam perspective, so that there is this understanding what happens also in terms of your own experiences, glimpses, so that you know how to savor these glimpses, as well as to be able to have a certain qualified, if you will, perspective on what this particular experience may herald or may bring about. So this subtlety, or rather the crudeness, from crudeness to the subtlety, is a daily affair. not everything fixed in stone. Not always there is the same tension. This tension fluctuate, vibrate, depending on a lot of factors. We're not talking about this now from the perspective of how our nervous system vibrates in each state of consciousness, but rather to give us that overall view, overall perspective. So this dynamics between Aham and Idam, as we progress on a spiritual path, and as we begin to taste for the very first time, maybe more acutely, these states of greater union of subject and object, union between the subjective nature of experience, because every experience is subjective. No experience is ever objective. Everything, because it's pertinent to the subject, the experiencer. And the nature of this experience, it depends on the quality of awareness of the one who here is acting as that instrumentality of that awareness in a given moment in time. And the neurophysiology here acts as that instrumentality. So, in the unfoldment of the highest states of consciousness, all meditators, all those who go through awakening, know there is this phases where one says, I am this. It's this more intimate relationship with experience and the objectivity of that experience. When one says, literally feels that, I am this. So in other words, I am, this Aham, is no longer Aham and Idam. It's not me and that experience, whatever that experience is, exemplified by the object of that experience. But it has this flavor, distinctive flavor. I am this. In other words, I am, but I'm also this mountain, this landscape, this tree, this situation, this whatever. Whatever is being experienced as the object is being recognized as also being extension of myself. Therefore, this I am this. This is one of the gradations or one of the tastes of unity. Then there is this I am. This I am. In other words, there's this reversal of that experience in terms of recognizing that what still presents itself as that thisness of the world in one's own self. When we recognize that within our own self, we speak of it in terms of this I am. You see the difference? You see the subtlety between I am this and this I am. I'm deliberately relaxed, this very well-known Vedantic or Shankaracharya's, Adi Shankara's Mahavakyas, so as to not confuse ourselves here. And some of you who are listening to this, watching this, may be much more savvy in your study of Indian philosophy or any other traditions, and something may come to mind. Yes, indeed, Adi Shankara's 4 famous postulates, which are reformulations of the Upanishadic teachings known as Mahavakya, right? Tattvamasi, Aham Brahmasmi, and so forth, all are variations of this, what we speak about now, in terms of Aham Idam. The Kashmir Shaivism operates, therefore, with this Aham and Idam as mantras in many, many, many variations, from Aham Idam to Aham Aham, Idam Idam, Aham Aham, Idam Idam only. In other words, all these variations of how this can be perceived, experienced. And we gave ourselves this now, where the taste of union, where we recognize ourselves in the world, whatever that world of experience happened to be. And when we recognize the world in ourselves, these are degrees of subtlety, but they are all part and parcel of experiencing subtler, much more profound state of consciousness than complete division between aham and idam, between what I am and whatever that experience happens to be. Then there is this, of course, because it will be very, very important to bring this into the discussion, even though it's an experience that one cannot really speak about and it's not easy to articulate. But there is this I am as I am, or I am what I am. In other words, it's a cessation of subject and object dimension altogether. It's the merging of subject into the object and object into the subject. When that takes place, there is singularity of experience. There is neither this nor I am as a perceiver. The experience of aham and idam merged, and only aham and aham remains. I thought to bring this for just to introduce this understanding, because every one of you can examine whatever you have experienced in your life and apply this understanding, and you will see how many people may have tastes, however minute, of this in our lives, which goes unnoticed. And this profound philosophy speaks about it with precision and clarity. So this, if you will, just an introduction to the self-realization in terms of how it is understood in Kashmir Shaivism, where the regaining the state of unity or regaining that Shivahood is also in the dynamic, in the relationship between this, what is exemplified by this perpetual continuous experience of I-amness, that universal egoity that Kashmir Shaivism operates with as a perspective, leaves no place for a subsidiary ego or subsidiary personality. It's simply inconceivable. It doesn't come into, this is no longer will be a monistic perspective. Anything that we come up with, and if we fail to understand that, then somehow we are bounced into the dualistic perspective whenever we speak of it from that where this, oh, well, I'm just this ego, but one day I will become Shiva. No, that's erroneous understanding, erroneous perspective. And this, in turn, of course, produces undesirable consequences. Now we're speaking of this, when that philosophy is being usurped or taken by a lesser developed beings who simply use this as a, if you will, bypassing or explanation behind that what otherwise is completely engrossed in inertia, and therefore one speaks of this taking that the cherry of this, the taking the core of this understanding into this what is nothing other than display of arrogance when it comes across from a person who simply does not wish in any way to give themselves to any spiritual transformation, because they accept themselves as they are, because that's already Shiva. Shiva in disguise enjoys this ignorance. Well, that's it. Fantastic. I'm going to remain in that state because that's already Shiva. This is why there is also reminders how these teachings need to be handled, how they need to be passed on, the responsibility of preceptors when they work, and also the necessity of applying the upayas so as to make sure that this is eradicated, so that the possibility for real evolution can take place and the person is not remaining in a status quo just because mentally they somehow have this idea fixed that they are already almighty, absolute in disguise, and that no need for any work, because that's coping out, frankly speaking. But that being said, if someone is completely happy, joyous, filled with bliss, for these people, there's no need for spiritual work. If they understand this principle, and if they understand this lofty concept, and they feel already with bliss and beatitude of their being, obviously, why and who needs this work, right? Most likely there is already an enlivened, active Shakti. Most likely there is some kind of process. Maybe one is riding the waves of spiritual sadhana done in previous lives. This is not at all completely unheard of. This happens, and in this case, well, let's see when the fruits of that, let's say, are fully exhausted, and if the person has not done anything that they can in this given moment in time to progress further, then perhaps there will be a necessity to pick up sadhana much later on in life, when all this kind of happy-go-lucky energy is exhausted itself. So I'll leave that to your further contemplation. And to give us this now reflection on, so what is it all for? Why is it of value to us? What is this really all about? How is this teaching relevant, to our time? To whom it is addressed? And why this philosophy, which thrived and produced the most outstanding examples in terms of those who made this for what it is known today, who lived, 1,000 years ago. Why is it important today? Why is it relevant at all? I'd like to say a few words to that. I'd like to draw your attention to that as well. Well, first of all, that why is it of value to us is because any philosophy which is not a chair philosophy or armchair philosophy, and remember in the very first part we talked about it, that there is no possibility of just studying Tantra, because that's an oxymoron, although some people will argue otherwise. But I'm not going to go into these fruitless arguments, purely scholastic in their nature. For us, what's important is that whenever there is something which can assist us in reclaiming our happiness, reclaiming our beatitude and bliss, which will make us simply a happier people, must be of our interest and must be applicable to us, because that's the way of life. We will lie to ourselves utterly and entirely if we somehow declare that we don't give a hoot about the state of affairs of how we feel. If we don't give a hoot in terms of our well-being, this is a lie. It's not true. Any honest examination, even people who consciously derail themselves or destroy themselves in terms of whichever way they find, they do that out of tremendous pleasure they derive in the way of doing that. If you analyze that, then you will see that everything we do has that element of joy concealed somewhere within as the highest price. Everything. Even the trajectory of whole spiritual disciplines, any spiritual tradition we may speak from, East, West, now, doesn't matter. The subordinate nature of all these disciplines culminates in that what is our own joy. Joy overrides it all. Joy becomes that coveted prize. Joy is all there is, the whole purpose of existence. That ananda, that beatitude, joy, ecstasy, enjoyment, is the very purpose of why we're here and also who we are in essence. These are the understandings of this school of thought. And it is applicable to us simply on the account of it's irrelevant when and how certain spiritual teachings came into being and were devised, as long as they are bearing the fruit, as long as they are applicable to ourselves, to our lives. And it just happened that the practices and perspectives that Kashmir Shaivism is known for are precisely rich in that. So it's something maybe of the past, which is uncovered, discovered, yet it's redolent and fragrant. It's not at all a philosophy of some kind of dead, empty tomb opened somewhere where life thrived and today it's gone and has dust all over it. In fact, it oozes with that what our own essence really is all about. And so the reason why we speak about it and bring it as a platform of teaching, because of its applicability and because of its relevance to our time, therefore. And of course, those of you who are more familiar, let's say, with my own background, with where I come from, with interests and so forth, you know that artist is that indispensable part of my setup. And it is that what is the most appealing that I find in the teachings of Kashmir Shaivism, because it's the teachings tailored to the realization of our creative potential, which is nothing short of the creativity of Shiva himself. According to Kashmir Shaivism, it is the power of Shiva, the power of his creative intelligence, that is the display of his spiritual prose. And the spiritual prose here are synonymous with creative prose. It's a creative act. So in other words, it's a very different, I'd say distinctly different perspective to a Vedantic crow flying over the palm tree and coconut falls down as an accident, simply superimposition. This is the illustration often mentioned in Vedantic scriptures, Vashishta Yoga in particular, to give this complete dissociation between the Maya and the Brahman, between the ultimate reality and the appearance of this world. In Kashmir Shaivism, it's a positivistic perspective where the world is not only an illusion or some kind of byproduct of an accident, an appearance in consciousness either. It's nothing other than a reflection of the magnificence of Shiva. It's Shiva in disguise. Shiva disguises himself in the world as the world, and then goes through the thrill of rediscovering himself through the world. You see? So it's this profound perspective that drew me to it, post factum, to give the most clear explanations to my own insights, spiritual insights above all, and profound breakthroughs that made it a most useful and practical of all spiritual disciplines and perspectives I came across myself in this life. So therefore, of course, I speak from that perspective. It's simply easy. I find it at home. I find it's applicable. I find it relevant. And therefore, I always speak about it from that direct immediacy that when it all boils down, if you ask me, so who is these teachings are tailored to? Who do you, how do you see the progress? What would be the mark of this teachings work? To me, whether you realize complete union of Shiva Shakti or not, is beside the point. But if you become more creative, daring personality in terms of your display of these internal, inherent powers, if you really, really rediscover that universal artist within, that poet in you, dormant poet, if you hear the song of your own making, this means the teaching is working and alive. And that makes me happy. That makes me sleep well. That makes me, or that makes the bread that I eat that much sweeter. So this, to summarize it, to make it very, very concise, is the path of beauty. This whole lofty spiritual philosophy is spoken of and referred to in a nutshell as the path of beauty, because it's the path of reclaiming the universality of ourselves as the artist, the creator, where the most coveted state is not even self-realization. Self-realization is the prerequisite. Realizing the self is a prerequisite. And the cherry on the cake of self-realization is that what is known as kamatkara, that delight incomparable to any, that kamatkara, that kama, joy, that term? Delight, beauty, kama, pleasure. It's that what is ecstatic delight of beholding and recognizing one's own magnificence in this world, as this world, through all these experiences, even through the passing phenomena of transmigratory experience, of transmigratory existence. It's all about. This is what this profound Tantra is about, is to reclaiming that and live in a state of perpetual wonder, in a state of ecstasy, which may display itself or experience itself not necessarily always in these overwhelming orgasmic waves which makes us send us rolling on the floor. It may be experienced as that shimmering waves that go inside, that tremor, that sense of palpitation inside, that shimmer, that pipilika, incomparable to any other experience. Sanskrit term, pipilika, literally. That shimmering, trembling tremor experienced at the base, at the heart of everything that we experience here. So these are the perspectives on self-realization. So I thought to share them with you freely for your own consideration and for your own understanding, because it has to be made your own. Philosophy will remain idle speculation until it becomes a lived reality of your own self, applicable to your life, to your situations, relationships, and everything you consider yourself worthy of living for. So let me take this as a chance to pause for a moment, and as I'm having a glance of time, you realize that in order to give ourselves to Q&A session, we would have to skip that guided meditation today, and all of you are welcome to replay any of the guided meditations in the previous part 1 and part 2. But in terms of how much we still would like to cover, I would suggest that we move to question and answer session without further delay. Okay? So I'm just waiting from the team to email me the link to the Google Doc email, because my WhatsApp is disabled on my computer right now. Okay, wonderful. Here we go. I've got it all nicely opened in front of me. Can make it also larger so I don't need to lean forward too much. Right. So there are quite a few questions, and I will go through them. Maybe some short questions will be answered with a short response. There's quite a few. And let me see this. Okay, so they're the same. There's two, right? Could I request you to also add to this list the questions that have been submitted in previous ones as well, in previous broadcasts? Okay. How does one know if which center the Kundalini is currently at? Okay, so Kundalini is not in the center. You see, it's not in the center as we speak. It's best to understand this, that Kundalini is not, let's say, even though spoken in terms of, let's say, classically as a serpent, because maybe certain experiences were kind of analogous, even in terms of its tactile nature, like that rising, hissing serpent. Maybe because it is associated also, classically speaking, a lot with serpent power in dreams, that symbol of that creature. So it's not like Kundalini here is some kind of entity goes into a certain center and then resides there and then goes into another center. This is where we come to the limitation of the language. We have to speak about it. And just as Ramana Maharshi was mentioned in the previous broadcast in relation to that, when he spoke about Kundalini, he always reminded us that because we speak about this in relation and from the perspective of the body, therefore this notion of speaking about it is pertinent to the body. And we then begin to speak about it as within the body. But it's not within the body, it's within and without, because it's not in the physicality of the body. We cannot say whether Kundalini is in the stomach or in the chest or in the throat. This is incorrect perspective. So therefore, there is no way to say where Kundalini is in terms of its current stage of the ascent of consciousness. Kundalini goes up and down. In other words, as the energy itself, it has its dwelling, as it is classically acknowledged and very often clinically reported. I will maybe say a word or two. Rests, dwells, and reposes at the base of the spine in Muladhara chakra, in Sanskrit known as Muladhara, associated with the earth element and that completeness and fullness of embodiment. In my interview, my first interview for Buddha the Gas Pump, I spoke about it with minute detail, precisely from that clinical perspective, so that a lot of people can relate to. Unfortunately, these interviews are no longer available because the host felt I'm not credible teacher enough to be represented by his platform, and he removed both of my interviews from his platform. And these interviews are no longer available to watch, but only to read. They've been transcribed, thank God, by our team members. In the first Buddha the Gas Pump interview, I spoke about clinical nature of experience, which doesn't even begin necessarily at the base of the spine, but will be experienced in the tingling sensations of the left foot, often at the toes, tip toes, then the whole foot will be involved. So the clinical perspective differs from classical perspective because clinical perspective is not accompanied by classical understanding of the yogis who went through these processes, but given to us by any Tom, Dick, and Harry householders who went through the process and simply gave us the clinical account of phenomenology associated with any of the phases of Kundalini. In the early phases in particular, Kundalini can be felt being active, not that Kundalini itself being felt. You see, this is again, as soon as I say this, I could hear how language play tricks. It's the activity of consciousness, what Kundalini here represents, begins to move and activate all major pranic currents in the body. It's electrical force, also in early stages, always fiery force. It is required, it is necessary. And this electrical force is being experienced clinically often in various parts of the body, most commonly in the feet, especially in the left foot, because that's where the circuit of energy moves from the left foot until it goes through the full circle and culminates, goes all the way down to the right foot. Then from there it begins to, if you will, present itself in a myriad of other sensations. One may have tingling sensations in the knees, in the thighs area. These are clinical experiences. Where will Kundalini be at that time when this experience? It can be anywhere. Another difficulty of locating Kundalini just by hearing someone's direct account is because most of the electrical responses are received in the brain, obviously. Well, all of them. So not most, all of these responses are experienced in the brain cortexes. So even when Kundalini is active in the lower region, this may be accompanied by phenomena inside the brain where one has this variety of sensations and even visions of light, kind of sounds, explosions, that one may feel or think that Kundalini is already active in the head. That is not so. So the short answer to it, it's not possible to locate Kundalini at any of its stations simply by self-examination. The only or the surest indication of the Kundalini process is the progress on the path. And this progress is measured by psychological changes that take place in the individual, because it's an alchemical process. So whenever it is accompanied by certain breakthroughs, there is this sense of arriving somewhere. And one can feel as if a great, tremendous cleansing took place, breakthrough. In the moment, and as we're going through this, it may be experienced in a painful way or not in a painless way. It may be thrown in flares of this or that alignment, illness. But as the full integration takes place, then it begins to display and manifest itself in a certain renewed psychological state. You see, these are more, if you will, or surer marks of how to investigate into the nature of the process itself, rather than clinically simply say the Kundalini is at the heart or Kundalini is in the, in the throat or in the third eye. All this kind of like one have to be really avoid this kind of fixed perspective because they're not very helpful. Following up question: how does one know if the Kundalini has stabilized after its ascent? Again, partially has been answered. One would know if Kundalini is stabilized is if this, what been just mentioned a moment ago, gives us this unmistakable sense of having one's, well, practically all, I would say, responsive to anything in our life. Our psychophysiological setup, our psychic setup is having this sense of renewal, but at the same time, stability. It's stable. It's no longer like, oh, I'm experiencing this peace and platitude, and I'm experiencing this happiness and I'm experiencing this harmony, but this trepidation, it's going to go, or something happened and it's gone. You see? So obviously, the stabilization of the process here is measured by what this and how it manifests in terms of the responses that we have. Responses we have, and how do we know these responses and what these responses are? This response is all how it is all fired through the network of nervous system. And Kundalini goes through nervous system, it rejuvenates it. It removes the stresses along with deep-seated traumas, revitalizes whilst at the same time bringing to the surface material which belongs to the unseen karmic realm. So therefore, there is another domain which is also very rarely spoken about, is where one is karmically, planetary-wise, what trajectory one is going through as well. All this is inseparable from the activity of Kundalini, which is experienced still at the individual level. So at the same time, if you remember, I've mentioned earlier that, not today, but in previous days, that the nature of this process is such that whenever certain heights are reached, there is immediate propensity for stabilizing the experience, any spiritual breakthrough. And Kundalini one can have this new level reached in a single sitting, in a single retreat, in a single, let's say, situation where one knows that there was this definitely a definitive breakthrough. But then things seemingly go all the way back to how they were before. Yet the memory of that experience stays within the psyche. And it is begin to get integrated into the fabric of our awareness there and then. What contributes to this integration is our ability, capacity, wisdom, and knowledge to assist that process in whichever way we can, equipped with knowing how to be in assistance to this process versus to becoming victims of self-sabotaging qualities. What is the difference between awakening of prana and awakening of kundalini? Is awakening of prana a precursor to kundalini awakening? Can you speak of the levels, intensities of awakening? I have the feeling we've answered that question in part 2, when I said that the term prana is another term for kundalini, and kundalini is another term for prana. Prana is simply something which is, again, yogically speaking, it can be spoken of as vital force, vayu. Kundalini as such, as the goddess, because also classically speaking, Kundalini here is not just some kind of, again, some kind of entity, and we don't know what that is. And this is where classical perspective helps us because it speaks with the language, deals with a language, which otherwise culturally does not exist in many, many cultures. We could even say that most cultures lost any understanding and awareness of these processes and do not have the vocabulary to speak about it. Therefore, clinical perspectives are all there to lean on. And yet, culturally speaking, Kundalini is the goddess. She is Shri Kundalini, holy Kundalini. It is the goddess, it's this feminine attitude to consciousness. It's the power behind all transformative processes. And the transformation here is being spoken in reverse. Just as this individuality came into place as the result of the emission and transformation of consciousness into solidifying, calcifying, right, metamorphing into this. Likewise, that process is assisted by the same power of Shakti, Kundalini Shakti. Therefore, prana, Kundalini, again, with reference to that interview, I would recommend all of you to go and read at least second interview I had with Buddha the Gas Pump, which is already available on our journal, in our website. I don't remember the exact title of that, but hopefully someone in the team will leave a comment later under the video with the link to that, and read second interview, 2.5 hours, painstakingly talking about all this from the perspective of prana, from the perspective of prana. and giving it classical perspective versus clinical perspective, back to classical perspective. I just want to make sure that you have proper answer, and we've got it all neatly offered there. So please go and read more about this. It's all freely available for everyone. And that has second question here, and that's from the same person, from Alison. The first sutra of Patanjali Yoga Sutras, Atha Yoga Anu Sashanam, assumes eligibility, readiness for awakening of Kundalini. Can you speak of factors required to receive, hold, and build the Kundalini energy? It's a good question. These factors, if I understand, and could be spoken of in terms of prerequisites. And although, again, out there are a lot of perspectives that if Kundalini is awakened in someone, well, that already answers the questions, means it's ready to awaken. I do not abide by that point of view. I think it's immature, inconsistent with our experiences, and actually irresponsible perspective, because that's not the case. In my experience, there are many, many people who have gone through awakening, who had Kundalini awakened under whatever circumstances. It's beside the point. And yet that only brought calamity into their life rather than clarity and beatitude, confusion and lack of understanding rather than purpose. You see? So therefore, psychological content ideally should be ready to receive the full blast of awakening. In our programs, in our retreats, we work with modalities which aim at activation of the pranic field, so that individuals who come to our retreats and programs are, if you will, at once have the chance to heal incomplete or erroneously, let's say, behaving Kundalini. Whilst at the same time, those who are new to the process can build their light body, their pranic field, so as to be able to successfully hold this process whenever there is this readiness to receive the full measure of what awakening Kundalini is known for. And of course, in some, it's in more visceral, in more acute manner, in others, in much more gentler, in much more gradual way. So the readiness here is sincerity of intent, psychological maturity, at least to a degree. I'm not going to say that one has to be completely psychologically mature, because it's inconsistent in our day and age. We live in the age of immaturity. Immaturity is promulgated. We live in a flimsy culture of, I don't even have words for it right now, but you get me what I'm trying to say. So, and disciplined approach. These are the prerequisites, so that purpose, that sincerity of the intent, you see, I've mentioned it first, is the first and foremost. Sincerity, innocence, even, of the intent. Certain degree of psychological maturity. Qualities such as discipline. And, well, readiness to receive. These are the prerequisites. By the way, it's not to make a plug-in. Amrita Mahadevi, my wife, will have a few words at the end of this to announce the online course. But this coming course is precisely tailored, that we are about to launch, precisely tailored for what are the prerequisites for spiritual work proper? So there'll be a lot of answers in that, but just as a quick response to this question. Okay, so just quickly this. The spontaneous kriyas seem to be happening for hours and hours on end when I surrender to them, and it exhausts me a lot. Is there a risk that too much of this would harm the physical body? Well, it may not be a risk of harming the physical body. The physical body is quite resilient, and if it's not at all fueled by some kind of also subtle form of eagerness added into it, then I wouldn't worry about the physical harm, but the pressure on the endocrine system is more of a concern, because kriyas is not just kriyas, it's not just physical movements, right? It's not just spontaneous movements. It's the whole psychic body and physical body is charged with this energy. So therefore, I normally advise people not to suppress kriyas, but as a precaution on the other side, not to indulge in kriyas either. I don't know whether you have the teacher, whether you have facilitator, whether you do this work. What is the container? Do you have sadhana? Do you have practice that safeguards this? So that there is this, where these kriyas can manifest in a more harmonious, in a more kind of contained way, and then allow you to walk and be active throughout your day without being burdened by it too much. So in other words, I have a question in turn for you, but not for you to answer it here. It's for you to think about it and consider this to address the situation properly. Is there a way to codify or read the quality and significance of kriyas to develop a greater context of where the journey of Kundalini is within our neurophysiology? Well, I don't want us to come up with the library, although it's tempting. We have a fantastic collection of imagery, of so many mudras, of so many variety of asanas. So it's like, yes, definitely, we can probably have a bestseller there. But I don't want us to create a glossary of kriyas and begin to speculate on whether this somehow marks the process. That being said, kriyas and mudras and all these physical manifestations become more subtle. And the shaking, tremors, and trembling of the body may remain for the rest of your life, as often given in the examples of great saints even. The actual kriyas, some of them, there might be some signature kriyas that you will carry with you for a long time, maybe for life, I don't know. But that does not give us any legitimate possibility for assigning the physical manifestation of the process with what is happening to consciousness. And again, of course, in the earlier raw phases, there seems to be more explosive nature. We've seen a lot of people who come to our programs display this rawness, right? It's a very flow-like process. It's not a chair process, it's a flow. Therefore, if you have seen pictures and videos and films from our programs, it's always a floor, covered floor. It's a solid ground because people can roll, people can do asana spontaneously, right? So it's a kind of visceral, physical, raw process. But then it moves into more harmony. The asanas themselves, the mudras, the kriyas become more interesting, orchestrated, almost as if there's this kind of like orchestration, a certain dance behind it all. So then, of course, that means that there is a greater harmony in the movement of prana. Yes, we can conclude that this is the case. how much this is in terms of the quality of, or whether this is associated with higher states of consciousness, this I would not go as far. How would one proceed if Kundalini is rising in Vajra channel? Can this be a reason for spontaneous celibacy? How one would proceed? One would be advised to seek a help of a qualified teacher, adept, who can assist in retraining Kundalini so that it can re-enter the proper channel, because also this maybe invites a possibility to tweak. There is a height also. If Kundalini finds its free pathway, it will begin to use that free pathway. It's almost like it will pave the way, and it will go repeatedly into that all the time. So therefore, in rehabilitation processes, very well known in Kundalini Vidya, of which we will speak more in a specifically dedicated course, as I have mentioned, we will give the large part to that. But just to say, this cannot be done DIY at home. It can only be done in proper, systematic way of addressing it, so that this can be remedied from the ground down, so that Kundalini can rise properly in one of the desirable pathways. I don't think it is associated with spontaneous celibacy. This does not sound to me at all. In fact, when Vajra channel, when Vajra Nadi is all that Kundalini has found, that causes, in fact, a tremendous loss of psychospiritual energy through excessive sexual activity, because the person is aroused and very often found themselves in a lot of sexual activity, which, funny enough, even one way or the other leads to the kind of like diverted way of how the sexuality is expressed. But hey, I don't want to go there, because we might be opening here something we don't want to deal with right now. But no, it's highly unlikely that this is the reasons for spontaneous celibacy. What can one do to assist the painful purification process besides diet and meditation? Is karma yoga and the devotional offering of all work activities, including the mundane activities, a valid solution? Yes, absolutely. Beside diet and meditation, all these are tools. And sometimes even the right diet can only take us as far. But these more subtle practices, offerings, offering of oneself, offering of one's, let's say, time, effort, offering of one's attention, all these devotional practices, they create and work at a subtler region. Diet is a must. It's paramount. Knowing who you are in the body, knowing your constitution is a must. You see, this is where we no longer can afford to be amateurs. We have to learn. There's no way out of it. But it has its limitation when it comes to certain subtleties which are more connected with karmic repository, if the purification is particularly painful, and this devotional practices and practices of karma yoga can be very helpful, as well as, of course, reading spiritual literature, right? Accounts of spiritual breakthroughs autobiographies, and everything that kind of helps to align within, helps to bring and internalize this process, because it's an internal process. Someone who thinks they can go through Kundalini awakening while they're running around the world pursuing their goals, they're deluded simply about the nature of this process. Not that one will forever be cave bound or kind of house bound, no. But if one goes through the process of purification, the greater internalization will be paramount to the greater ability to have greater work done. It's so simple. How can one know that Kundalini is on which chakra? Why do we feel so much intoxicated after sadhana? Well, it's a kind of almost a repeat of the question we talked about. Why do we feel intoxicated? Well, because we connect to the bliss of ourselves. When we connect to that, the sadhana and spiritual practice, when they're properly devised, give immediate almost access to that bliss body, immediate access to this, which is the source of all joy. Senses gain their providence from there, right? Everything, sense of taste, sense of touch, sense of smell, all this what we like, right? Rub ourselves with all these expensive oils, right? We love that lovely massage. We love that cuddle. We like that caress. We love that kiss. We love all these spices, and we love all this, all this what sensory perception here belongs to is not, and does not exist on its own in the world of physicality. All this gains its providence in the subtler realms of this existence. And the subtler realms of this existence, on these tanmatras and all these blueprints, they themselves gain this from bliss and nowhere else. You see? So we're connecting to the bliss of our own self. So of course it is ecstatic and intoxicating. How to deal with physical symptoms of Kundalini awakening while doing sadhana. Bhastrika starts and I'm unable to control. At that time I can't, but afterwards I have breathing and sinus issues. Well, you need to make sure you do the shat karmas. So in other words, certain preliminary practices so that you can eradicate you may have sinus issues that are simply being brought to the surface because it's a long kind of seated illness or some issues that psychosomatically expresses and manifests that way. And the spontaneous pranayama, in this case Bhastrika, brings it out. But you need to make sure that there is no possibility, right, that there is this sinus issues that you currently have, and you can assist with the help of Ayurveda, with the help of diet, with the help of these external applications versus internal understanding, so that when you sit down to do your sadhana, then you will less likely to experience these unwanted outcomes of this or that resurfacing. And it's not uncommon, the variety of pranayamas, when they come, the main purpose of that phase of pranayama, spontaneous breathing, is of course purification. And among the yogis, there is a term, not even so much meditating, not so much sitting. It's like, where did you breathe? Like, where did you do your breathing? It's like, I did my sadhana with this teacher, but then, normally, traditionally, you receive your instruction and you work. So there's this jargon, that kind of like slang talk. It's like, where did you breathe? Or where have you breath? Because that phase of breathing, phase of pranayama, is a very important phase, where a lot of purifications are assisted and facilitated through the phase of that spontaneous pranayama. And it's a really, really very important phase that should not be neither carved nor subjugated, not to be afraid of. It's a beautiful phase, but just make sure that you are also addressing this from the perspective of what the sinuses can be addressed in terms of strengthening digestive fire, right? You know, what sinuses have variety of provenance, you know. I don't want to go into the psychosomatic nature, but also sinus also related to the lack of attention. You know, someone feels somehow one is not receiving enough attention, you know, then psychosomatically it may display itself as sinus, you know, that excessive problem in that area may have the culprit elsewhere in the way we emotionally process information. But it is our duty also to know how to remedy it at the physical level, which Ayurveda here addresses. Okay. Okay, and this will be final question from this session. I'm currently menopausal. I have been experiencing symptoms of active Kundalini for 12 months. I'm wondering whether my stage of life and diminishing sexuality or diminishing sexual vitality will affect the Kundalini rising. Maybe there is a bias we need to address here, that sexuality, which often Kundalini, when we speak about it, it's also often spoken in terms of that power, which has that force to it. It's, yes, it's the power of sexuality. But the power of sexuality is not only displayed, or rather, we cannot speak about it only in terms of how it displays itself in its desire for procreation or sex or pleasure. The menopausal phase is a phase of withdrawal, some changes in the body, above all else in the endocrine system, hormonal changes. It's the phase which female body undergoes through so as to come into another area of life, very often much more centered, much more beautiful. Every account, or most of the accounts of women I have come across, they all report greater confidence, greater self-apprehension and understanding of one's needs in life, of one's relationships with the world, of one's relationship with oneself. So this, if you will, kind of heralds a rebirthing. So it's not that you become less sexual being. In fact, there is this also very well known renewal in the physiology. When the female body goes on the other side of the menopause, the sexuality may experience complete revival, if not renaissance. So therefore, let's not create any these assumptions that somehow the menopausal phase in any way diminishes our spiritual prose, diminishes our sexual power, which is required for self-transformation. That is correctly so. So therefore, I want you to understand that from the subtler perspective, more all-encompassing perspective. You know, just because our culture kind of promulgates that constant sex drive doesn't mean that if someone comes out of that drive or no longer expresses much interest in that, even if temporarily, that they are less sexual beings. So, okay, well, I think we ought to wrap it up. And what I suggest is that we're going to take all the questions that we haven't had the chance to answer right now, along with quite a big list of questions that have been already made from the two previous parts. And we will address these questions on their own separately, most probably in our own pre-recorded session, and then share it freely with all of you on our YouTube channel. Okay. So thank you, everyone, and we'll see you around. Jai Gurudev. Let me just see. I don't know if Amrita is around. As some of you may know, we have a little in the house, Uma, and she's only 4 months old, so she asks sometimes for a company at any time of day or night. Amrita? Okay, so no, she's not available. Well, in that case, then we're not going to make this announcement. What I suggest is that the team maybe share this announcement into the comment section of the video with all the required information. All of you who are interested, please feel free to take an opportunity from having a special rates for our online course, which we're going to offer midsummer this, I think it starts in July, if I'm not mistaken. It's a very interesting course, I think very useful, entitled Yoga of Integrity. So it's going to be offered live in this way of broadcasting with plenty of chances for interaction. Okay, folks? Lots of love. Bye for now.